Ideas shape the world. They give meaning, direction, and possibility. I'm Willie Pietersen, former CEO, Columbia professor, and author of Leadership: The Inside Story, an exploration of the principles that have shaped my leadership journey. Some ideas last for centuries. Others emerge and redefine how we lead. This is Ideas That Matter.
Welcome, Willie, to another episode of Ideas That Matter. Today, I'd like to talk about a topic that's very timely, and it's called strategy. I want to address the question, what is strategy and why is it so important? It seems as though there's no consensus on what strategy is by definition, or even the mechanics and the tasks involved in developing a strategy. Is that something that you've also observed?
Yes, absolutely. You've put your finger on something really important here. Strategy is a high-stakes activity. Getting it wrong is not a good idea. And the trouble we face is that strategy is widely misunderstood and misapplied in organizations in the commercial sphere. It's much better understood in the military where it was born, but I'll get back onto that later on. Michael Porter, who's really the major thought leader in the whole arena of strategy, made the observation that strategy is very seldom understood by corporate executives. And there's some research that backs this up, actually, that in a large survey, something like 2/3 of the executives could not recall what their organization's strategy was. Now, if they can't recall what it was, can't act on it. So the big missing piece here is finding the way to think productively about what strategy is. And only when we've clarified our thinking can we hope to do it well. We have to think about its origins, understand what it's all about, before we can excel at doing it. Now, what I actually find quite frequently in the consulting projects that I do, I start out by saying to the organization, tell me how you do strategy now. And what I find is that it's largely built on the old kind of planning methodology, all about numbers rather than ideas, very seldom about winning, much more about how we're going to compete, etc. And then I find that I spend a good amount of my time before we can even begin clearing up the misconceptions and getting everybody on the same page.
And what do you think the source of all this confusion is?
Well, I think to understand that, we need to find the answer in the origins of strategy. As I mentioned earlier on, it was born in the military. It was not born in the business world at all. And the military understood something that corporate executives seem to have overlooked. And that is that there is only one reason why we need to have a strategy in the first place. And that is because of the reality of limited resources. If we had unlimited resources, we wouldn't need to have a strategy. We could sit in an armchair, throw resources at our problems all day long, never run out of resources. We'd last forever. Risk-taking would be irrelevant, and we wouldn't have to worry about competitors. Now, there's no such thing as unlimited resources. You know, you can get into a fantasy world and say, well, what would it be like if I had unlimited resources? And then, you know, you'd survive forever. Life would be easy. Now, the fact of limited resources is a harsh reality. It forces us into a zero-sum discipline of making choices that really define what our strategy is. That's really the task. Now, let's think of a few metaphors here. Let's think about the game of chess, kind of the ultimate strategic game, if you like. And the reason why chess is an excellent example of strategy. It's because you have to start by understanding the whole board, where all the pieces lie. You have to understand your likely competitor moves. You have to think ahead about your counter moves. You have to think about how you're going to create advantage, not just in short term, but in longer term. And you have to understand that if you run out of resources, you've lost. So that's how we define who's won or lost a game of chess. If your pieces are trapped by your competitor so that you can't move them, they're paralyzed, you have limited resources, you can't pull out more of them out of a basket or something and say, oh, well, I've got some more over here. Now, the thing about chess, it's a game. So everybody gets the same number of resources. In the real world, there is asymmetry. It's not a game. We don't get equal resources and told, well, now game it out, play it out and see who wins. There's asymmetry. Sometimes we have greater resources than our competitors do. Sometimes we have fewer resources than our competitors do. And that's what makes strategy difficult. And it's not always the one with the greatest number of resources that wins the game in the business world. It's the one with the smartest deployment of those resources. Now, if we think back to the introduction of the iPhone, which is a brilliant move at the time, Nokia, BlackBerry were top of the heap. They seemed to be unassailable. At that time, Apple had much fewer resources to work with than either Nokia or BlackBerry. But they outsmarted them by conceptualizing this thing they called a phone as a mini computer, which is mobile and you can carry it around in your pocket. And that idea is what wiped them out. Now, you see examples like this in the military as well. And when you think about the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine, Russia has vastly more resources than Ukraine does. But Ukraine has held out for 3 years. And they've been very smart at their deployment of scarce resources. And drone warfare is something that came out of that kind of intelligence system. How can we outsmart our competitors? So it's always about this smart deployment of your limited resources. The war in Vietnam is another interesting example of this. There was a conference that was held years after the Vietnam conflict, and the two sides discussed the conflict. The North Koreans and the Americans discussed the conflict at the time. And one of the questions on the American side, I don't know whether this story is true or not, but it captures the imagination. One of the questions that the Americans asked the North Vietnamese, because America lost that war, and the North Vietnamese had vastly fewer resources to work with. So one of their big questions, Robert McNamara was leading this conference, apparently. He'd been the Secretary of Defense during the war. And he said, we kept bombing the bridges, there are numerous rivers in Vietnam, to stop you from bringing your supplies across those rivers. But you kept sending the supplies across the rivers. How on earth did you do that when there were no bridges? And the answer was, we rebuilt those bridges 6 inches under the water, and your radar was not strong enough to pick it up. I don't know whether that story is true, but I read about it. But it is illustrative of how, with fewer resources, greater smarts, you can outperform your competitors.
Yeah, I heard a similar story about Apple when they were developing the iPod, the music, that Steve Jobs was in a meeting and somebody pitched him the concept of, I think, a 10 gigabytes, very, very small drive. And they said, we don't know where to market it. We're looking for a solution for this. And he said, I'll buy a year's supply of them. He bought all the supply and nobody could compete, which is, I think, another example of managing limited resources. He bought up the resources to the advantage of his own business, put everybody else at a disadvantage for a year. So What I'm understanding so far, Willie, is that what we're looking for is a definition of strategy. Did the military leaders or businesses that you would highly recommend? I mean, is there a definition of strategy that we can put in place and use going forward?
There certainly is. And that strategy is a derivative of the reality of limited resources. All the logic of strategy and strategic thinking flows from that reality of limited resources. This is something the military understands, commercial world not so strongly yet in their ways of dealing with strategy. Now, based on that logic, Karl von Clausewitz, who was a Prussian general who fought against Napoleon, learned a lot of hard lessons during that phase. After the wars against Napoleon, he became the director of the War College in Berlin. He was a kind of real thought leader in the whole arena of military strategy, and he created a definition. And this definition is timely, although he wrote his book in 1832. The book was called On War, and he provided this definition that I think is applicable to all spheres of activity that requires competition. And here's the definition he provided. I'm quoting him. Of course, it was in German, and so this is the translation. And what he said was, the talent of the strategist is to define the decisive point, then to concentrate everything on it, removing forces from secondary fronts and ignoring lesser objectives. That's an extremely powerful definition. Identify the decisive point. Now, the identification part requires a very strong intelligence system. You're not going to guess what the decisive point is. So it always starts in the military with superior intelligence in advance, like the Israelis have done so well before their bombing raids against Iran. And the same thing with the Americans when they did it. It was a long period of superior intelligence gathering to create the kind of precision that happened on the day. So identifying the decisive point requires that level of intelligence gathering first. Now, what is the decisive point? The decisive point is the difference between winning and losing. It's what I call our winning proposition. That's the decisive point, the swing factor, where you apply best use of your limited resources and prevail. So that's the decisive point. And then notice what follows after that. Concentrate everything on it. Not just a few things, everything. It's all about the power of concentration. And then it follows after that to talk about subtraction. Yeah? Removing forces from secondary fronts, which Napoleon didn't do successfully, and that was his ruin. And it was Hitler's ruin as well. He created secondary fronts and lost the Second World War. So removing forces from secondary fronts and ignoring lesser objectives. So much of this, concentration requires subtraction. And I think what the companies are not good at, none of us is really good at subtraction. And I have a little formula that I apply here. Subtract first and then multiply. And that's the way you win the game with limited resources. Subtract first, then multiply. But I come back here to the Apple examples, if I may. When after Steve Jobs left Apple, and he left it for a period of about 10 years, he'd had a run-in with the board, I believe, a lot of friction, and he left eventually, created his own business. 10 years later, he came back, and Apple was in dire straits. And very few people gave it any reasonable shot at recovery. But he did lead that recovery. And the very first thing he did in doing so was he subtracted 70% of all of the activities and products, and then based the entire turnaround on the remaining 4 products. And that turnaround worked brilliantly well based on that power of concentration. And Apple became the largest, most valuable company in the world. It's jockeying for position now as we speak with, Microsoft and Google and others. Became the most valuable company in the world. And when I say that, its market value is greater than the value of the Russian economy. So it's a kind of a massive achievement. But he started with subtraction. And that's really the key. Very few people do that well.
So what I'm hearing from you, Willie, is that we need to get the decisive point, and that is the difference between winning and losing. So we've got to be able to evaluate markets and be able to say, here's the strengths and weaknesses of other people. Here's where we think our one point that we want to focus everything on would be. We know we're dealing with limited resources, and that's where strategy comes in. Who can best manage their limited resources to the advantage of themselves, obviously keeping everything simple. How do we implement that? Do you have some guidelines you can share with us as far as implementation steps, if I can use that word?
Yes, certainly. Let me start here by saying that strategy, as much as anything else, is a way of thinking that then guides our way of behavior. It starts with a way of thinking that is not intuitive. We're not born as strategic thinkers. We have to learn how to think strategically. And it's a flow of logic. It's inescapable. So let me review the flow of logic. It starts with the reality of limited resources and the fact of competition. Right, that's the starting point. That's the premise. Everything else flows from there. Therefore, it's about making the best choices on the effective application of limited resources in order to win the competition for value creation. It is about winning. That's the decisive point. It's not just about showing up and participating. It's about winning. So we start with the end in mind here when we think about ultimately what strategy is about. And it's about defining that decisive point. Now, in the commercial world, I think the decisive point comes from answering 3 critical questions. And if we can't answer those 3 critical questions, we can't claim to have a strategy. So here are the 3 questions. Question 1, who do we seek to serve? In other words, what game do we wish to play here? There are vast arenas we can compete in with our limited resources. If we pick a particular market, there are all kinds of customer segments that don't all want the same things. We have to pick who do we seek to serve and be very clear about that. That's the game we wish to play, to serve this group of customers better than our competitors do. That's question 1. Question 2 is what will be our winning proposition? Here's the definition of a winning proposition. What unique value will we provide to our chosen customers that gives them a compelling reason to choose us? Customers have choices. Why should they choose us? Biggest question in strategy. That's the margin of difference, the unique margin of difference that we provide that gives our customers a compelling reason to choose us. That's question 2. Question 3 then says, well, okay, we know and we've defined how we're going to win the game. Now let's define how we're going to deploy our resources effectively. What will be our key priorities for success? And what we've discovered through research now, Nelson Cowan of Missouri, the University of Missouri, has done some stunning research that says 5 priorities are the wrong number. It's between 3 and 4. It's back to subtraction, concentrating on the key things that matter most. So there are the 3 questions, and the answers to those questions represent your strategy, and then cascades through the entire organization, that then through its functions makes all of its decisions with reference to the answers to those three questions. There's a fourth question. How will we renew the answers to those three questions as the environment changes? So we can't have a static approach to strategy in a dynamic world. If the world was static, you would do strategy only once, and that would be enough. Give the answers to those three questions. But the answers to those three questions become overtaken by events over time. So we have to have a learning system that enables us, through action learning and re-examination of the external environment, to refresh the answers to the three questions. When we've gone through that process of logic, the rest remains creating a dynamic process to make that happen. But basically, that it all starts with that way of thinking. In fact, von Clausewitz, in his kind of final thoughts in his book, says strategy is not so much about what we have done, but much more about how we have thought about doing it. So that way of thinking, I think, through that logic.
Okay. And help guide me on, I'm going to use the word mindset. How do we look at the markets when we're answering these questions? I think in past conversations, you mentioned there's an outside in mechanism that we go through. Tell us a little bit more about how we frame the right mindset to constantly be monitoring and making adjustments in real time to our strategy.
Now, here we go to the realities, or the laws, if you like, of evolutionary science to guide us. And what we learn from evolutionary science is that there's only one way of surviving over time, and that is to adapt successfully to the realities of the external environment. The external environment won't adapt to us as a favor. We have to adapt to it, and the constant churning and change that's happening around us require us to look at that, examine that external environment regularly. There is a methodology, I think, that guides our thinking, and we really have to look at 5 areas of what I call areas of inquiry to have a good intelligence system. First of all, we need to look at the global trends that are happening around us, global economic trends, global population trends, etc. And then we look at the trends in our own industry. I mean, the global trend like artificial intelligence is one, supply chain management, which is constantly changing, that we have to look at those global chains and understand that what's happening globally. Then we have to understand the realities of our own industry, how those are shifting over time, and how they are changing the rules of success. Then we have to look at our own customers and understand their most important needs. Then look at our competitors and understand what they're doing to compete against us. That we have to overcome what they're doing to try and take our customers away by offering those customers better value than they do. And the final area of inquiry is to look at our own realities, our own trends in performance, our own strengths and weaknesses, because what we're then really examining is the alignment between our capabilities and the requirements of the external environment. And that's the gap we need to close in order to survive. That's called adaptation. But we need to really understand the external environment first. I had a very interesting assignment on one occasion, this consulting assignment. I'll disguise it for confidentiality reasons. But I was asked by a committee that had been charged with re-examining some legislation in the economic sphere. This legislation had been enacted 30 years ago, probably. The world had changed since then. And this committee was asked to re-examine that legislation and to determine how it needed to be changed to bring it in line with current realities. They came to visit me and said, we've been slogging away at this for 3 months, and we've hit a wall, quote unquote. Could you perhaps help us out? Well, let me try. We had our first meeting, and some very, very bright people, senior people from various organizations, both in the public sphere and in the private sphere, tackled with a rather important task. Well, I said, well, take me through what you've done so far, and so we can understand why you've hit a wall. Well, they said, we asked this question at the outset. How should we adjust this legislation? Now, at the outset, I could see that they'd hit a wall because they'd asked the wrong question. That question is an inside-out question. The only question that leads the way for us is outside in, not inside out. The world doesn't care what we do. They care only about what they get by way of benefits. Now, I had to be polite, obviously, diplomatic. But I said, can I invite you to ask a different question? Who does this legislation seek to serve? Who are the beneficiaries of it? Who is being targeted here in a policing sense so they don't commit misconduct? Who's it for? What are their most important needs that need to be addressed for this legislation to be adapted successfully? They said, well, we haven't done that research. Now, what we literally did, we went to Forbes magazine, actually, because they've got a section of their writers who do this kind of examination, ask great questions, great constituency holders. We made it international because there's no economic policy that can be kept in isolation from the international scene. They did this, and we came across 4 value gaps. These are the values that we need to deliver for the new legislation to meet its original targets and serve those constituencies. This is where we are today. Here's the journey for each gap, 4 value gaps. Now, we had to go to London to present this to international regulators who had to buy into it, to get everything coordinated. And it was a unanimous vote. And I remember I was sitting in a meeting in case needed. I kept my mouth shut. I allowed, the head of the committee to do the report. And I remember very well the committee chairman saying, really like this report. I particularly like the way that you did it through an outside-in process and led us to a very good solution. Now, no, that was a high-stakes issue of national policy, of very high-caliber people tackling it and asking an inside-out question and hitting a wall.
So we have the strategy in place now. We know what our decisive point is. We have our limited resources. We know that we have to be able to create the greatest value possible for our clients. So in your words, we can put more points on for them. That's winning, getting more points of value with our clients. So I've got all of this information and it's organized in my mind. Great ideas. How do I implement it into a plan now? How do I build that plan?
Yes, well, that is a whole other subject we can talk about, is the process for doing this. The one thing I would just point out here at this stage of the thinking through it is there's one key difference between military strategy and business strategy. In the military, you win by overpowering your enemy, conquering your enemy in some kind of way, disabling your enemy. In the business world, it's different. You don't win by destroying your competitor. You win in the business world by scoring more points for your customers than your competitor can. And that's the way you win. It's a triangle. So it's not a direct competition. So, well, let's try and destroy our competitors. That's going to take you nowhere. There's only one way of destroying a competitor. Ask Apple. And that is by scoring more points for your customers than they can. And now you've won.
Mm-hmm.
That's the winning way in a business.
Okay, so strategy and planning are two different things totally. Strategy is the conceptual. I got to get my strategic thinking and priorities in place so I know where to move my assets, and that is another version and takes you deeper into planning. Willie, I want to thank you for this particular conversation. It has definitely given a decisive definition that individuals can now apply to examining their markets and examining how they use their resources to get that decisive point, the use of limited resources to their advantage. And then finally, making sure that they're going through your small list of 3 different questions that they could ask concerning how do I put this strategy together in an organized format and begin communicating it. Willie, is there any last thoughts on strategy that you would like to impart or close with?
Well, only this, that strategy is not complicated. It's very simple, and therein lies its power. So we really have to understand its basics, capture the essence of it, be able to think strategically, and that knowledge in itself is powerful. Hi, I'm Willie Pietersen. Leadership is not about wielding power. It's about authenticity and inspiring others to achieve a shared purpose. Excelling as a leader is a continuous journey of pursuing ideas that matter as the environment shifts and new challenges emerge. Thank you for watching. Please share your ideas by leaving your comments below. We learn best when we learn together. And if you've enjoyed this discussion, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Thank you again.